everyone, and welcome back to Plainest Pages. Today we're talking about The Deliverer by Tishani Doshi. This is another poem on the Edexcel A-level English literature curriculum, and let's get started. This poem is in triplets and there's no regular rhyme scheme, meaning that there's no beat. So this shows that there's no room for uplifting melodies, there's no room for regularity, because none of this makes sense. The speaker is criticizing the fact that this is happening in the world, and she's arguing that none of this has reason to exist, which is why there should be no beat, no underlying path beneath the poem to give it a sense of direction. There is no direction and there is no purpose in these events other than discrimination. There are 3 sections, and it's important to note the significance of 3. So there are 9 months in which you carry a baby, which is divisible by 3. There are 3 stages in life: birth, and then adulthood, and then death. There are 3 significant stages in development of a child: 3, 6, 9. The person telling the story is also very significant because it's not actually the deliverer, nor is it the nun. It's actually someone we assume is the daughter of the deliverer. It could also be an allusion for God delivering Jesus to humanity as a way to save us from sin, as a way to save us, as a way to start anew, save humanity, as these kinds of symbols. But it's significant that it's not really a narrator who's directly involved, because it shows that it's someone both within the story, who's involved in the story and who's aware of this issue, but who's also not directly involved, as this is not specifically the baby that was dug up or the baby that's involved, because there's this symbol of a liminality, of a threshold, of someone who's not quite here nor quite there. And the theme of transgression is generally one that's very important throughout this poem, as are other themes of sin, taboo, and women in society, and gender equality and gender roles. The poem focuses on the prevalence of female infanticide in India, and it tells the story from the perspective of the deliverer's daughter who grew up observing her work. It can be compared to The Gun, Giuseppe Dall'Ama's Hireling, History, and Eat Me. With that, let's dive straight into the analysis. Our Lady of the Light Convent, Kerala. The sister here is telling my mother how she came to collect children because they were crippled, or dark, or girls. So the stanza begins with establishing the location, Our Lady of the Light Convent, Kerala. So a convent indicates that this is a religious place, it's safe, it's secluded, and Kerala is actually a region in India that has the highest percentage of Christians. So when it says the sister, it is of course referring to the nun. Our Lady of the Light Convent. So Our Lady has these connotations of purity, of gentleness, of nobleness, and of course it's a sharp juxtaposition to the girls who are treated as being far from Our Lady, as impure, as unwanted. This poem discusses the reasons for female infanticide not only in India but in a lot of other regions, especially rural regions, the fact that they're crippled or dark or girls. So this highlights the standard of children needing to be boys who are strong and light-skinned, because light-skinned is like the standard of beauty, the echelon of beauty, to be like strong boys who can help out on the farm, rather than girls towards which the mentality is like, oh, they're gonna leave anyway, like, oh, we're just gonna have to pay her husband to take her, she's not going to be helpful for the family. The nun is of course telling her mother, who we assume is the deliverer, about collecting the children, and because the speaker is listening carefully and attentively, we assume that this is one day going to be her job. And as you've noticed, the poem starts with a location, because the use of the locations is significant throughout this entire poem, as it shows us the distance that these babies have to travel, as well as the distance between these babies and their mothers who abandoned them, and the distance between these babies and healthy, wanted children, rather than impure and abandoned, crippled, dark, or girls. The stanza finishes with an end-stop line. It notes the finality, it notes the dire break, showing that this is it, this is the end of the story. As sad as it is, this is the reality for many of these girls. I mean, the distance that they have to travel is that big because this is how far they have to travel to find a comfortable home and a comfortable life. The simplicity in the statement and in general in the poem shows how girls are treated with simplicity and finality too. If you're a girl, you're thrown out. If you're a girl, you're abandoned. If you're a girl, you're buried. They're discarded. They face a tragically short life. The lack of figurative language here makes for a very straightforward and realistic imagery, appropriate for the presentation of this fact that, well, just because you're a girl, it just means you're thrown out. It's presented as a reason, as a logic, as fact, as something that you can't argue, and hence it's stated in the most simple way. It's as if they're saying, It's sunny outside, like a statement of fact rather than a statement of such a horrible abuse of human rights. And the polysynthetic list within crippled, dark girls, it emphasizes how easy it is for babies to be discarded just for possessing one of these characteristics. While crippled and dark are more rare, 50% of the time, the baby's a girl. It's even a little bit more than that. So it emphasizes the unfairness of living not only within India but really throughout the world, because this obviously doesn't only go on in India. It's a wider allusion to the unfairness of a patriarchal society. Found naked in the streets, covered in garbage, stuffed in bags, abandoned at the doorstep. There is no subject here. This is a very impersonal stanza. There's no room for humanity because they're not treated as humans. No room for individuality because for even for these nuns and even for the deliverer, these are just babies. Another baby that's been abandoned. Another baby that needs to find a home rather than a human being that they particularly care about on a personal level. They're covered in garbage and abandoned. We only know that it's children because it's mentioned, essentially. This is an asynthetic list because there's commas separating the descriptions. It's almost like it's a never-ending cycle of abandonment just because they're girls. And there's also a focus on the setting, not the babies themselves, where they're found, how they're found. It's really presented as a mundane situation, showing that unfortunately this is very much a ubiquitous occurrence. They're so dehumanized that the setting, ground and like trees and garbage cans are taken priority over the actual babies themselves. They become defined by where they're found. This one in the streets, this one in the forest, this one in the garbage, rather than who they are as people. Just like the entire existence is determined by whether or not they're light-skinned and able-bodied boys. The terms of found, stuffed, abandoned, it's reminiscent of toys, showing that likewise the babies are not in control of their own fate. They're treated as pawns, as entertainment for people elsewhere rather than their own parents. For their own parents, they're just a temporary occupation, really. It emphasizes just how vulnerable they are, and it also juxtaposes the comfortable domestic field with the semantic field of home and nurture and sister and brother with the dire reality. One of them was dug up by a dog, thinking the head barely poking above the ground was bone or wood, something to chew. This is a particularly disturbing stanza as a baby is mistaken for something to eat, potentially a reference to girls being eaten alive by the world, devoured by the fact that they lack any options to choose their own freedom and their own life. The baby is also referred to as one of them. The babies are constantly referred to in third person, they, them, it, because they're not valuable enough to merit the I, to merit the first person, to merit the individual. These babies belong to no one. They are an indistinguishable mass. It's just another case of one death is a tragedy, but a million become a statistic. There's also something so everyday and mundane and like bone and wood. These are just everyday things, everyday materials. A bone is a scrap of something that isn't wanted or given to a dog, just like a baby is. And the head is barely poking, reminding us of just how small these infants are, of just how much of a crime it is to bury something so vulnerable and helpless. And eventually the dog doesn't eat it, although it was left behind for the dog to eat, showing that some animals have more humanity than humans. Dug up has negative connotations of death and burial. It suggests that the girls have long been dead for the parents because they don't care about what happens next. It's ironic that it's the dog who's more human than the actual humans. It also symbolizes the irony of a society valuing purity and these Christian values when they're out there burying babies just for being girls. This is the one my mother will bring. This final line seems to end this section definitively. This baby dug up by a dog is separated from the rest of the stanzas just as it's separated from the rest of the babies because of the trauma and the shock of this occurrence. This highlights how there's a contrast between the speaker and her mother. The baby is just there for the purpose of the speaker's memory about the dog. It's not really about a baby. We see the contrast between the speaker and her mother and the baby's mother who abandoned her, the difference in the care and nurture. The baby goes unnamed and unwanted, just like the rest of the crippled and dark girls. Milwaukee Airport, USA. The parents wait at the gates. They're American, so they know about ceremony and tradition, about doing things right. There are 3 stars dividing this section, and again the number 3 appears. This time it's to show a completely different section, a completely different location, and a completely different world and mentality. The airport brings to mind again this idea of liminality, of a threshold, of a border. An airport is also on the border of different countries and different cultures, and it's on the border of a country that says that it's normal for infanticide to happen, and a country that would definitively disagree with that. Potentially, this is also pointing out the difficulties that the baby will face in the future, knowing the cultural differences and knowing its uneasy history. It also means that it doesn't necessarily mean that the baby will be free from discrimination. Just because it's wanted because it's a girl doesn't mean that it's going to be wanted because it's white. Now it's something for it. Again, it shows us that the baby never really has a chance to settle into a home. It's always an outsider. In one country, this is a heinous crime, but in another, it's a daily occurrence. But yet, at the same time, we can't help but feel that this is satirizing and ironizing American ideals and American beliefs as well. Because it says that Americans know everything about ceremony, but it feels sarcastic knowing that this whole transaction doesn't follow ceremony in the slightest. I mean, it's not a conventional thing to go and adopt babies from other countries. It's saying that if Americans were truly so concerned about culture and so concerned about saving the babies that they're condemning India for leaving behind, that they would all go out and do their own part in the story. The parents are also referred to as third person rather than the girls, because the girl that they are adopting doesn't yet have any sense of belonging to them or even fitting in. They haven't seen or touched her yet, don't know of her fetish for plucking hair of hands or how her mother tried to bury her. The parents don't know anything about this baby, only the deliverer does. For the first time, we see a focus on the child, but even when the baby's not named, because it doesn't really matter. Nor does the deliverer even particularly care about the baby. She only cares about the baby's fetish for plucking the hair off her hands because that's the only thing that she remembered from that. It's just a job. It's her job to deliver it, and it's a disturbing way to describe this as a fetish, suggesting that the baby has to grow up quicker than it should because it's not really a child anymore. It has experienced far more difficulties than most people do in their lifetime. The parents, who ironically value doing things right, don't bother understanding the girl's culture or background. They merely take the baby as a parcel for their own desires. Again, the baby's treated just as a toy for other people's wishes. But they are crying. We couldn't stop crying, my mother said, feeling the strangeness of her empty arms. There's ambiguity here in who's crying, and it's the first true instant of emotion throughout the entire poem. And it's at the strangeness of her empty arms. For the first time, the deliverer feels empathy for this girl who will grow up in a foreign land. This girl grows up on videotapes, sees how she's passed from woman to woman. She returns to twilight corners. There's a lack of proper belonging as the babies are shuffled from one place to another. This girl grows up on videotapes rather than a proper education. She returns to twilight corners, so meaning she goes back to things that were previously unknown to her. Again, this brings us to the idea of liminality, because twilight is that time of day that's in between day and night. This is the sole metaphor within the poem. It has mystic connotations. It has sibilance at the beginning of the line with the repeated S sounds of this girl grows up on videotapes. It creates a sense of danger. It creates a sense of mystery. It also suggests that the twilight corners will not bring positive things, as we of course know the dark childhood that this baby has experienced. We're well aware that there's potential for her to discover something far worse and far darker than she has known in her new life. The repetition of woman also encourages the view of her as an actual individual for the first time, rather than just an item that's being passed on. To the day of her birth, how it happens in some desolate hut outside village boundaries where mothers go to squeeze out life. Here the poem circles back to the beginning, back to the birth cycle that the speaker has heard of so many times. It's written in a monotonous and clinical way without emotion once more. Village boundaries are significant because the citizens of the village themselves know that all of this is wrong. They're on the boundary of morality. There's a loss of childhood innocence as the speaker for the first time figures out where they actually all come from. Squeeze out. It's ambiguous. It could also mean killing life, squeezing the life out of it. Just like this whole thing is on a whole spectrum of morally gray. Watch body slither out from body, feel for penis or no penis, toss the baby to the heap of others, trudge home to lie down for their men again. The poem ends with this graphic description of feeling for penis, and it emphasizes the gender differences, how men are prioritized, girls simply discarded. The phallic symbol shows their wealth and power. It highlights their status and their privilege as a man in a patriarchal society. The heap of others also suggests that this is the case for the majority of the village, as the men are obviously unwilling to part with their power, while the majority of women suffer both in life and in death. The word trudge shows the unwillingness of the women to go through with this, knowing that 50% of the chance their baby is going to be thrown away. By ending the poem on again, Doshi shows the negative attitudes continuing today and demonstrates society to be trapped in a repeated cycle. She encourages the reader to take action, and this line on its own emphasizes the importance of this message, that it's important to not have women trudge home to lie down for their men again. With the use of different tones, we see the gender contrasted and societies and culture juxtaposed. The brutal descriptions transgress societal expectations and urge us to admit this horror so that we may begin to address it. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and that it was helpful, and that it's a thought-provoking piece that urges all of us to take actions and try and change the world. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.